Hello, my name's Craig McLaren. I'm Director for Scotland and Ireland in the Royal Town Planning Institute. And we're here today to talk to the project team that's taking forward research which RTPI has commissioned, looking at how we can better measure planning outcomes. And that's all about looking beyond the traditional ways of assessing the performance of planning, things such as how fast a planning application is processed, how many planning applications you have, to something which is much more nuanced and which focuses much more towards the holistic and the impact-based approach to show what planning can contribute to that as well. The commission that's resulted as you'll hear, in a collection of practical toolkits and guidance that should help us to make sure that the planning system and its impacts are measured against these wider range of outcomes, including the environment, society and health, and also the economy as well. Our thanks go to a really interesting group of funders for this, who have come from across the UK and Ireland. The project's been funded by governments in Scotland and in Ireland, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and Welsh Government as well as the Office of the Planning Regulator in Ireland. And that in itself brought a really interesting discussion, debate, and input from a range of different perspectives and things as well. So with that, I'll pass you on to Iain MacPherson from Kevin Murray Associates, who's going to talk you through, or start off talking you through, what the toolkit is and what the research says.
Thank you, Craig. I'm Iain MacPherson, part of Kevin Murray Associates, and we've been leading this research along with an excellent team of academics and practitioners from across the UK and Ireland. We've had Cardiff University, MacCabe Durney Barnes based in Dublin, Yellow Book, University of Dundee, and Kevin Murray Associates. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all those who have contributed to the research through the survey, through focus groups in England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales. And in particular, I'd like to thank the local authorities who participated in the pilots. We're really grateful for the time given to the research, which has made this a much richer project than it would have been without it. Through this research, we've been very aware that in developing the toolkit, we want to develop something that's practical and helps create quality and value in places. So at the outset, just want to focus on a few benefits of the toolkit. Firstly, a renewed focus on outcomes and embedding this into our planning processes. We create an opportunity to think about the types of place that we're creating. Secondly, the toolkit will help to bring clarity around what impact planning has and how to leverage this more efficiently in the future. And thirdly, the toolkit will create an evidence base for decision making, but also for making cases at corporate, regional and national level around specific issues, such as the type of planners that we may need to get into the system. For example, do we need more support and expertise in health or in heritage? And lastly, creating these better quality and more valuable places that have a positive and holistic impact. And that's ultimately what we're wanting to achieve through planning. So at the heart of the research, we've got a series of questions that we've been asking. The first question is, what should planning be having an impact on? And to help us to answer this, we've looked to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This is a set of 17 goals that have a wide range from meeting basic needs through to being able to participate in democratic processes. And there are national expressions of this throughout the UK and Ireland, and these also have spatial expressions. The second question is, what does planning need to do to achieve this? And this means that we need to understand the inputs and the activities of the planning system, policy making, the objectives and targets of this. Thirdly, is our built environment reflecting this? We can have policies in place, but do we know that what's actually being built or indeed protected is meeting the intention of that policy? And lastly, how do we know that we're getting there? This cycles us back round to that top question. We need to monitor and evaluate the impact that planning is having, both the contribution, indirect and direct, on these higher level goals, such as the UN SDGs or national expressions of this.
In the first, we have a sequence from the core of what planning is, where we are now, and the need to appreciate as a starting point what is to be measured and why. And that could range from local plan policy goals, be they of an existing plan or indeed a new one. It could include regional or national performance outcomes, or it could include international objectives such as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The second level is around a consideration of what activities and behaviour is required from the planning system in order to deliver on those. And that requires key policies, clear objectives, but also decision-making consistent with those. The next level is around a consideration of the physical built environment that emerges from the interaction of these, and that the assessment is around measuring the development outcomes against that policy intent. And finally, in the sequence, there is a further level still, which is not simply about the direct role of planning and the physical outputs. It's also a wider consideration of the wider effects on the economy, on the environment, perhaps on population health and so on. And some of those elements planning directly influences, but also many of them it has an indirect contribution towards. That means that there are different levels of measurement to consider. There's a lower level focused on the direct activities of planning in terms of policies, objectives, and decisions made, but the intermediate level focuses on the development outcomes, and that is more related to focusing on the place, the physical environment, be it at street, neighbourhood, or village, town, or hierarchy of urban levels. But the highest level is considering the wider impacts and evaluating those across time and across space. And some of those are directly attributed to planning activity, and others are very much related to an interaction with other factors. But they still need to be tracked and measured.
As part of the research, we considered how some of these individual outcome areas were being measured. We have drawn lessons from other toolkits in the built environment. The tools are anchored to higher level goals, primarily UN SDGs. Most look well beyond narrow development outputs to consider wider economy, community, sustainability, health, and quality of life aspects within their goals. Indicators for these provide a common reference point. The outcomes are specifically derived to address the issues and goals sought for the place, neighborhood, or building. Any measurement exercise needs to be repeated longitudinally to track trends of change and understand impact. Multiple indicators can be used to measure each outcome, provided there is a relationship to the outcome goal. The indicator can change to suit national, regional, local circumstances and data availability.
Thanks, Rin. I'm now going to talk about the toolkit itself. The toolkit has 8 themes in it, and the purpose of these 8 themes is to capture the breadth of the areas in which planning has an influence. Place, design and people, health and well-being, environment, conservation and protection, climate change, homes and community, economy and town centres, movement, and lastly, process and engagement. The full toolkit is a process and pathway that Kevin has helped to explain. At the centre of that is a tool that has 5 steps around it. The first step is a scoping exercise where you establish why you're using the tool. What are you wanting to understand? Is it the policy intention that you're wanting to measure, or is it to think about the impact and contribution of planning? Step 2 is the collation of information. So you're wanting to pull together policy, monitoring and data information all into a single location. Once you've pulled into a single location, step 3 is a diagnostic review. You're able to diagnose and understand how policy is following through to delivery. Step 4 is around assessing the impact. Is planning having the impact intended? What actions need to be taken? And Neil will share shortly about how we intend scoring to be undertaken that helps to assess the impact. And finally, the last step is step 5, review, resolve and implement. This is a critical part of the process, and it's about a reflection and feedback loop into the next cycle of running the tool.
The toolkit for measuring planning outcomes includes a scoring and also a visualization of that scoring as part of the toolkit. As part of the scoring, what we've used in the toolkit is a ranking of 1 to 5, which shows the extent to which there is progress towards the outcomes that have been set out. So a score of 1, for example, would be not achieving progress towards outcomes, and a score of 5 would be excellent progress towards outcomes, and a gradation of that as you go through the scoring. All of the scoring in it inevitably involves a degree of evaluation, but gives a sense in which there is progress towards that outcome. We've also linked the scoring against benchmarks to actions as well. So, for example, there might be a review of policy and the need to understand implementation better for a score of 2, or a score of 5 with excellent progress towards outcomes, meaning that there's opportunity here to share learning with others and in relation to best practice.
The toolkit itself has a spreadsheet element to it. I'm going to run through the columns and then take an example from it to help understand how that functions across the different levels. So the theme column, those are the 8 themes. You've just got a selection of them on this slide. The reference number column, that's a way of keeping track. There may be other ways that you may wish to do that. Policy or objective column, this is where you would identify the theme-related policy or objective, depending on the structure of the plan. This material would primarily be drawn from a local development plan or a regional development plan, but other strategies or master plans can also provide material. The next column is about the objective and target, and within a policy, there is likely an objective in there or a target, so it's just a matter of extracting that and putting that into this column. The monitoring indicators column, this material will largely be drawn from monitoring statements and the associated data with that. So again, this is about extracting the data from those documents and lining it up with the correct policies and objectives, and doing likewise with the data. And lastly, the achievement score column. This is an assessment of the data against the target, and that is how progress is monitored. So to take an example, we're going to go to the environment row. The policy example here is about heritage building reuse and about which applications will be supported and why. And the objective within this is that reducing the at-risk register for buildings. So reuse of heritage buildings on the risk register, looking for a 15% annual reduction of the current list of 40. And the monitoring indicator there is the number of applications that have been put in for at-risk buildings. And the data we have is that 8 applications were made, and that's a reduction of 20%. And that represents a score of 4 as good progress being. Moving on to level 2, we're now thinking about development outcomes. The policy and objective is the same as is the objective and target. But this time the data that we're drawing from is around completions. So completed refurbishments and bringing buildings back into active use. And the data that we have there is that there have been 4 completions, which is a lower number than expected in terms of buildings back into active use. So this receives an achievement score of 2 in this case. Level 3 is asking the so what around the impact. We've been giving consents for heritage buildings, we've been monitoring completion of works. What difference is it making and why? So the policy is the same. The objective here is a bit more nuanced. It's about we want to reuse our heritage buildings because it creates an attractive environment in our town centres. And the evaluation indicator and data here is being drawn from, for example, local economic development reporting. Number of day tourist visits to the town centre heritage attractions, a big increase from the year before. So this policy is having a positive impact on the town centre and getting an achievement score of 4. Through the project, we've created several variants of the toolkit. The first is the common toolkit, which provides a framework for measurement, thinking about alignment with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This toolkit here is particularly relevant for English authorities, and it provides a framework for thinking through impact and outcomes in terms of alignment and contribution to the UN Sustainable Development Goals.
And in Ireland, we have a strong hierarchical policy framework with the National Planning Framework, Regional Spatial Economic Strategies, and development plans at the lower level. The Office of the Planning Regulator has developed the Planning Performance Assessment Framework, which currently is relying on output indicators, but this project now allows us to consider the development of outcome indicators. What we see here in the slide are the 10 national strategic outcomes for the National Planning Framework, and we have aligned these with the 8 themes of the toolkit, and they are further broken down by key policy objectives. I think our own experience of applying the toolkit in Ireland is that it is really a methodology and a set of principles that really needs to be adapted to the jurisdiction, to the level in the hierarchy, and needs to have regard to the availability of data. I think in Ireland we anticipate that it can be used, the toolkit can be used in identifying key outcome indicators and assisting in the formulation of monitoring and performance measurement frameworks. Key obviously will be the evaluation of planning outcomes and the impact of planning. But I think also importantly, it can be used as a plan making tool, starting with the end in mind and devising policies that are appropriate to achieve those objectives.
For the Scottish toolkit, we've aligned this with the national performance outcomes that have been set by the Scottish Government. And these outcomes, they describe the kind of Scotland that the government aims to create. And it reflects the values and aspirations of the people of Scotland. It aligns with the UN SDGs, and it helps the government to track progress in reducing inequalities across these different topics in Scotland. And these align with the toolkit themes. Spatially in Scotland, in Scottish planning policy, similar outcomes are reflected, and these are also going to be expressed in the National Planning Framework 4, which will be coming out in 2021. Applying this in Scotland through the pilot studies that we did, it was recognised that pulling all of the information into a single place was very useful We have the planning performance framework in Scotland, and it provides a really useful look at some of the more qualitative aspects of planning. But being able to pull together the quantitative and qualitative into a single location in itself was a useful exercise for the pilot areas. And the toolkit also supports the relationship between plan making and development management. It provides data to have these conversations around if a policy doesn't seem to be having the intended outcome. There's data to have a conversation around it.
We've also worked closely with the Welsh Government and other stakeholders in Wales to adapt the toolkit for a Welsh context. And we've kind of made sure that the tool is kind of adaptable to link with the policy context applying in Wales, both more generally and in relation to planning policy. So we see kind of close alignment between the toolkit and the ability to kind of connect it to the well-being goals as part of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So, for example, a Wales of cohesive communities, a healthier Wales. And we also kind of link it to those ways of working, so the methods and approaches that kind of also kind of linked to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. We've used that kind of overarching context to then also link it to the planning policy context in Wales, and linking the themes of the toolkit to the existing sustainable placemaking outcomes included in Planning Policy Wales. So we can see those on the bottom part of the slide here, 5 different groupings of sustainable placemaking outcomes and the ability to link the themes in the toolkit closely to these. So we've got mapping to those national sustainable placemaking outcomes. We've got a link to the overarching context of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And we see this as kind of then being very closely involved in, for example, the preparation of local development plans as the place where our stakeholders argued that all of this idea of measuring planning outcomes and what we're working towards come together. But we see this equally kind of linking well with emerging strategic development plans and also kind of potentially having aggregation to a national context as well.
So as you've heard at the very start from Iain, there's a lot of different benefits that comes out of the toolkit around this focus on outcomes, around thinking about how planning can contribute to the future, and generally thinking about how planning can contribute to better places. I think there's some really exciting things around this. I think the fact that we've actually brought together a group of organisations, consultants and funders from across the UK and Ireland, where we've all shared, learned and developed our thinking on that has been really, really valuable as well. And I genuinely think that this could lead to some form of fundamental shift in the medium to longer term on how planning is understood, how it's measured, how it's valued, and how it's undertaken. So that was just a brief summary of the toolkit and the research. What I would recommend is if you want to find out more about it, you can find all the resources on the RTPI website, which is www.rtpi.org.uk. Thanks very much, and thanks to all our contributors today.